Under the pale shimmer of a morning sun, Mark Randy stood at the edge of his land, boots planted firmly in a patch of frost-glazed grass that had not yet thawed from the chill of night. His ranch stretched wide behind him, a rugged spread of wild pasture, weathered fencing, and a winding creek that curled like a silver ribbon through the land. He had owned this property for nearly 15 years, enough time to know every bend of the creek, every stubborn patch of overgrowth, every suspicious foxhole that turned up near his livestock pens. But what he saw now didn't belong, and it made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Across the creek, not more than 50 yards from where he stood, a wooden footbridge had appeared, not some boy's contraption made from scrap, but a proper multi-panel construction with newly sunk supports on both sides, a modest handrail, and a freshly painted sign that read, "Scenic Walkway Access, Community Use." The words were written in a crisp serif font, the kind that screams bureaucracy disguised as neighborliness. Mark hadn't given permission for any walkway, and he damn well didn't authorize anyone to drive posts into his land. He exhaled, sharp and slow, watching the fog of his breath dissipate over the frostbitten field. He didn't need to walk closer to know the truth. His landline was being crossed, literally and legally. The creek was not a border. Both sides were on his deed, bought clean when he took the property off a retiring couple's hands years ago. They'd warned him then, in a tone both cautious and resentful, that the housing community next door was the kind that liked to spread. He remembered chuckling back then, chalking it up to old-age paranoia. But now, staring at the uninvited bridge quietly anchoring into his soil, he realized just how prophetic that offhand remark had been. Mark wasn't a man who enjoyed confrontation, but he wasn't built for compliance either. He came from a long line of ranchers who didn't ask for help and certainly didn't tolerate encroachment. But this wasn't just about pride or tradition. It was about legal rights, private land, and the quiet erosion of boundaries. It was how it always started. A friendly project for the good of the neighborhood, a temporary setup that wouldn't be a bother, a structure that shouldn't matter if you've got nothing to hide. And then, just like that, it would be. Permanent, mapped, codified, acknowledged, absorbed. Mark had seen it before, not on his land but in other places, with other people who'd let things slide until it was too late. He pulled his phone from his pocket, not to call anyone, but to check if he'd missed a notice. Nothing. No voicemails, no letters in the mail the last week, no emails from county planning or code enforcement. Whoever built the bridge hadn't gone through him, and judging by the freshly tamped gravel path leading up to it on the other side, it hadn't been a last-minute job. That was planned, funded, executed, and worst of all, someone had assumed he wouldn't say a word. He did a slow circuit of the bridge from his side, noting the materials, the layout, the engineering. It wasn't shoddy work. Someone had hired a decent contractor. The supports were driven deep into the bank, the boards thick and newly treated, the nails uniform. But the water line was deceptively high here. This part of the creek flooded easily after spring thaw, and Mark knew from experience that soil near the bend undercut faster than it looked. That meant whoever built it had either ignored the local land survey or never consulted it in the first place. Or worse, they assumed any problems would be his to deal with. He spotted tire tracks along the far side, narrow and spaced evenly, probably from a light utility vehicle or work truck, fresh enough that the morning dew hadn't dulled them yet. And along the edge of the path he saw boot prints, 3 different sets from the looks of it. That meant not just a crew, but a surveyor, maybe a site manager. A whole procession of people had walked this route and made executive decisions on his land, none of which included him. That thought chilled him more than the wind cutting through his jacket. Back inside the house, Mark poured a black coffee and sat at the wide oak table that had once belonged to his father. He didn't sip, just held it for the warmth and stared through the window at the stretch of land now bridged without his consent. He felt the creeping weight of inevitability trying to set in. They wanted him to react emotionally. That was the mistake most people made, storming into offices, shouting down phone lines, putting fists to fences. That only made them look unstable, uncooperative, and, most importantly, ignorable. Mark had no intention of being dismissed. Instead, he pulled out the property folder from the cabinet in the corner, the one with every land survey, boundary map, tax receipt, and permit he'd collected since buying the ranch. He laid out the documents methodically, checking lot numbers, coordinates, cross-referencing the surveyor's grid with his hand-drawn field notes. The bridge was unequivocally on his parcel. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He highlighted the coordinates, snapped photos with date stamps, and began drafting a formal letter of inquiry addressed to the county recorder's office. He kept the language civil but firm, requesting all documents related to temporary access permits or community infrastructure plans within 100 feet of his parcel over the past 6 months. Then he sent another copy to a private land use attorney he'd met years ago at a cattlemen's conference, someone who specialized in pre-litigation boundary disputes. Mark wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't about to let this slide into precedent. He knew the kind of people that moved into the development next door. Some were decent enough. Young couples, retirees, and a few self-made business types who wanted to play cowboy with their designer boots and occasional fire pits. But others, the ones on committees, the ones who worded things like inter-community collaboration and shared natural space, those were the real threat. They didn't take land, they repurposed it through planning boards, outreach campaigns, and strategic confusion. It was a game of documentation, not fences, and the only way to win was to be louder on paper than they were in meetings. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing that day. No calls to neighbors, no post on the town bulletin board, no confrontation across the creek. He knew better than to let them see his hand before it was ready. Let them think he hadn't noticed, or that he was slow to respond. That would only make it easier to tighten the vise later, when he filed a cease and desist backed by land survey certification and enforcement language. It wasn't the kind of war that involved rifles and barbed wire anymore. It was fought in county offices and legal briefs, and he was damn sure going to fight it with every tool at his disposal. As dusk settled in, the bridge stood silent and unattended, a pristine arc connecting land that never asked for a connection. Mark watched it from his porch, coffee now swapped for a tumbler of rye, and allowed himself a single thought. Not of revenge, not of outrage, but of strategy. He wasn't afraid. He was prepared. And whoever had built that bridge would soon understand that some boundaries aren't just about property, they're about principle. And this one wouldn't be crossed again without consequence. It was only 3 days later when Mark's inbox lit up with an email that carried a subject line both polite and presumptive. Notice of incident, community infrastructure use. He clicked it, expecting perhaps a tepid apology, or at least some clumsy attempt at justification. But what greeted him was an official-sounding document written in the stilted, overly sanitized language of liability. It began with a sterile recounting of what it called an unfortunate malfunction of a shared-use pedestrian access structure that had resulted in minor injuries sustained by members of the adjacent community. Mark stared at the phrasing, his jaw tightening at the word shared use, as if ownership had already been casually redistributed through a turn of phrase. Then came the clincher, an implication that the landowner, him, had possibly contributed to the structure's instability by failing to provide foundational maintenance for terrain under cooperative access development. The bridge had collapsed. It had given way while in use. And now, somehow, Mark was being lined up as the fall guy for someone else's unauthorized construction. That morning, according to the message, a group of residents had decided to celebrate the completion of the Access Project with a small gathering. There was champagne, apparently, laughter, pictures taken, and then, without warning, the central span had cracked with an audible snap and dropped several people straight into the rocky creek bed below. 2 individuals were sent to the urgent care clinic in town. one with a broken wrist, the other with a fractured collarbone. Emergency services had been called, though they didn't contact Mark at the time, perhaps assuming he had been a willing party to the whole enterprise. The email made it clear that an investigation would be opened, and it made something else clear too, if one read between the lines. Someone was looking to deflect blame, and Mark was the most convenient target available. He closed the email, set his coffee down, and stared at the wall for a long, silent minute. There were no words that came easily. Not anger, not confusion, just a cold, rising certainty that the situation had already escalated into a legal snarl before he'd even had a chance to say no. This wasn't just arrogance. It was coordinated. Someone had bypassed every layer of the common decency and now had the gall to imply he had failed to maintain land they had trespassed upon. Mark wasn't impulsive, and he knew that action taken in anger usually bred mistakes, but he also knew there was a line between patient caution and fatal hesitation. He called his land use attorney first. The man, Philip Westbrook, answered on the second ring with the calm, distracted tone of someone deep in paperwork. Mark explained the situation in plain terms, sparing no venom but keeping the details sharp and factually tight. Westbrook was quiet for a moment, then let out a soft, dry exhale. "They're testing liability framing," he said. "It's textbook. Bridge fails, someone gets hurt, then they pivot to the landowner. If they can suggest even partial negligence on your part, it muddies the waters enough for them to negotiate favorable settlements with their insurance, or, worse, pin costs on you." Mark asked what came next. Westbrook told him not to respond to the email directly. At least, not yet. Instead, he suggested gathering every record of the property boundaries, photos of the bridge before and after the collapse, any signs, markings, and, crucially, the soil survey that proved the bank was not suitable for structural support without reinforcement. Mark had all of that. He'd kept meticulous records since the day he bought the land, not out of paranoia but because that's how his father raised him. If you're going to hold ground, hold it with evidence, not just conviction. The next call Mark made was to the county building inspector's office. He posed as a curious landowner who had heard about a nearby collapse and wanted to ensure it hadn't affected his plot. The woman on the line, efficient and polite, confirmed that no permits had been filed in his area for temporary structures or footbridges in the last 6 months. That, he noted, was useful. She even offered to send a formal letter verifying the absence of documentation, and he accepted with thanks. If this was going to become a legal matter, and it clearly was, he would need to build a trail of institutional non-involvement to prove that the bridge wasn't just unauthorized but unacknowledged by any regulating authority. Later that afternoon, a white SUV pulled up just past the gravel bend near his property line, and out stepped a tall, clean-cut man in a navy jacket, followed closely by a woman carrying a clipboard. They didn't approach his front porch. Instead, they made their way directly to the remains of the bridge, which had already been taped off with a thin strip of yellow warning ribbon. Mark watched from a distance through binoculars, just enough to read the lanyards swinging from their necks. Not police, not county officials, private legal team. He recognized the name of the firm from the footer of the email earlier that morning. He didn't confront them. There was no point. They would say they were gathering evidence, assessing damages, documenting the site. Exactly what he was doing, except he had the advantage of truth. What he did do, once they left, was walk the perimeter of the bridge again and take high-resolution photos of every remaining beam, every impact mark, every splintered plank now scattered like bones along the edge of the creek. He documented tire marks, too, which now overlapped with boot prints, suggesting return visits even after the collapse. He noted how the far bank, on the development side, had already begun reconstruction efforts. There were fresh chalk lines, a stack of new lumber, and flag markers driven into the mud. That meant they weren't backing down. They were planning to rebuild, and likely hoped to bury the blame before anyone could challenge the narrative. By early evening, a formal envelope arrived by courier. Hand-delivered, signature required. Inside was a letter, 4 pages long, full of legalese but unmistakable in tone. The firm represented several injured parties, and while they weren't yet filing a lawsuit, they were putting him on notice as the property owner under whose land the incident had occurred. The language was careful, calibrated, and slippery. Mark scanned every word, then reread it twice, looking for openings and implications. They weren't attacking. They were fishing, for weakness, for overreaction, for an email or a statement that could be twisted into an admission. He didn't give them one. Instead, he sent the documents to Westbrook and asked for a full formal response, one that outlined the unauthorized nature of the construction, the absence of permits, and the fact that Mark had neither invited nor approved any structural development on his land. And while they were at it, he told Westbrook to include a cease and desist order regarding any future construction or repair efforts that crossed onto his property. The next morning, Mark found tire ruts again, this time deeper, fresher, and veering off the path they'd used before. Someone had come back during the night, maybe to inspect, maybe to lay groundwork, maybe to test his patience. But the real test was already underway, not in the field, but in the slow, deliberate game of leverage, and Mark was preparing to meet it head-on. He wasn't dealing with vandals or thieves. He was dealing with professionals who wore clean shoes, carried clipboards, and smiled as they undermined your ownership 1 inch at a time. But what they hadn't counted on, what they never expected, was that the man on the other side of that bridge wasn't just a rancher. He was a landowner who understood what land was really worth. Not in dollars, in permanence, in memory, in the right to say no and have it mean something, and that right he would defend without flinching. Mark had never been one to let restlessness dictate his moves, but over the next few days he found himself waking before dawn, staring out across the fog-heavy pasture toward the creek like a man anticipating something he couldn't yet name. There was a pressure building around the edges of his life, silent, invisible, but undeniably present. The yellow tape that once marked the collapsed bridge had vanished, removed sometime in the middle of the night by hands that left no trace beyond tire ruts and a few snapped twigs. More than once, Mark thought he saw movement beyond the far bank, a flash of a reflective vest, the sound of voices too far away to discern. But when he crossed the field to investigate, there was only silence and an increasingly organized collection of materials, neatly stacked lumber, rebar, and bags of quickset cement resting beneath a tarp weighted down with bricks. He didn't take pictures this time. He knew what he saw, and he didn't need evidence of what hadn't yet occurred. The message was clear enough without it. They were going to rebuild, probably in the dead of night, quietly, with minimal visibility. And when it was done, they would present it as fait accompli, another irreversible structure too costly or inconvenient to remove. But what bothered Mark more than the brazenness was the implication. This wasn't improvisation. It was protocol. These weren't opportunists acting on a whim. They were organized, supported, and confident that no one was coming to stop them. 3 days later, Mark received a notice from the county registrar's office. A new entry had been submitted, a request for a temporary utility easement across parcels adjacent to the development's south sector. The parcel in question was his. The request had not been approved yet, but it had been filed, and that meant they were now trying to create legitimacy after the fact. If they managed to get it through, even on a provisional basis, it would create enough legal ambiguity to delay enforcement. That's when the window opened for them to construct first and argue later. Mark contacted Westbrook immediately, forwarding the notice and demanding a formal objection be filed with the county clerk before the request was ever reviewed. Westbrook assured him it would be done within the day, but Mark knew how slow bureaucracy could move, especially when politics and money worked quietly behind the scenes. That same evening, something changed. He was returning from the far field, having checked the irrigation lines near the northern slope, when he noticed movement near the east tree line, close to where the old barn sat, half concealed by overgrown brush and shaded by cottonwoods. There was a vehicle parked just outside the boundary. dark gray, unmarked with a tinted windshield. A man was standing beside it, one hand on his hip, the other holding what appeared to be a phone or remote. Mark didn't approach. He simply stood at the top of the ridge, watching as the man noticed him, nodded once without smiling, then climbed back into the SUV and drove off without haste, disappearing into the trees as if he'd never been there. Mark walked down to where the vehicle had been, and sure enough, the grass had been flattened and the gravel disturbed. He checked the nearby fence posts and found something that made his blood turn cold. Mounted discreetly on the far post, half hidden beneath a branch, was a motion-activated camera, the kind used in wildlife studies or rural surveillance. It was new, fresh, not rusted or weather-worn. Someone had placed it there recently with care and with knowledge of where it wouldn't be noticed at a glance. He didn't remove it. Not yet. Instead, he documented it, took photos from multiple angles, recorded the serial number, and called the sheriff's department non-emergency line. Deputy Franklin arrived 2 hours later. He was young, probably not long out of academy training, and the nervous way he adjusted his belt told Mark that he wasn't quite sure what he'd walked into. Mark walked him through everything. His ownership of the land, the unauthorized bridge, the attempted blame for the collapse, the easement filing, and now this. Surveillance equipment installed on private property without consent. Franklin took notes, nodded, said all the right things, but Mark could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable. He wasn't brushing it off, but he also wasn't committing to anything actionable. Mark didn't push him. Instead, he asked for a formal report to be filed and requested a copy. Franklin agreed and removed the camera carefully, placing it in an evidence bag with gloved hands. As he left, he said something that didn't sit right with Mark. It might not be a crime, depending on who installed it. Some companies work under community safety contracts. That was a phrase designed to sound official while meaning nothing at all. Mark didn't say what he was thinking. If this was a community safety program, then why was the camera hidden on the private side of a fence pointing inward? The next day, Mark's mailbox contained an envelope. No return address, no stamps. Inside was a printed leaflet, freshly laser-printed, clean and impersonal. It was a community newsletter from the development, featuring an editorial section titled Shared Responsibility and the Burden of Legacy Boundaries. It didn't mention him by name, but it didn't have to. The piece spoke of outdated land ownership models, of the need to embrace fluidity in access and design, and of the dangers of clinging to private restrictions at the expense of shared growth. It was manipulative, strategic, and deeply unsettling. Mark sat with it for over an hour, slowly folding and unfolding the paper while the sun sank beyond the hills. It wasn't just trespass anymore. It was a campaign, a soft war. Not the kind with fences and locks, but the kind that took place in planning rooms, advisory boards, public comment sessions, and legal filings. And in that context, refusing to play their game was the most dangerous position of all. It made him an obstacle, a static point in a moving map, which meant the pressure was only going to escalate. He returned to his study, fired off another letter through Westbrook, this one requesting a full record of all land use committee meetings for the last 6 months and transcripts of any proposed development discussions that included his parcel number. Westbrook, to his credit, didn't flinch. He responded within the hour, already coordinating a public records request through the county clerk. That night, the silence felt thicker. The wind carried a different weight. Mark checked the doors twice before turning off the porch lights, then sat with his back to the fireplace drinking water instead of rye. The sound of gravel outside made him tense, but it passed. A deer, perhaps, or the wind. But he knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The first escalation wasn't a confrontation. It was surveillance, paper trails, and subtle threats. And Mark knew, beyond any doubt, that it was only the beginning. The 4th week began with a letter. Not from lawyers this time, nor from the development's committee, but from the Regional Planning Commission. It was printed on letterhead, official but oddly casual in tone, informing Mark that a public meeting would be held the following week to discuss updates to the county's open access corridors and community integration paths. His property number was not listed explicitly, but the accompanying map left no room for ambiguity. A green dashed line, labeled Proposed East Trail Extension, ran directly through the eastern third of his land, tracing the same route as the now-collapsed bridge and snaking north toward a larger arterial road that bordered the county. Mark stared at it for a long time, taking in the implications. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an overstep. It was a coordinated move. The bridge had been only the first step, a physical wedge placed in advance of a much larger administrative play, and they were moving fast. Too fast for this to have been improvised in the last few weeks. The paperwork, the planning sessions, the legal language, they'd been preparing this months in advance, long before any bridge touched his land. He drove to the nearest records office without waiting for Westbrook's report and requested access to the minutes of every planning session for the past 6 months. After 2 hours of waiting, filling out forms and presenting identification, a clerk finally wheeled out a box of files, all printed and neatly tabbed. Mark didn't ask for copies. He sat in the office's quiet reading room and worked through each document methodically, page by page. What he found was damning. Not explosive, not illegal, but damning nonetheless. There were notes discussing resistance from legacy owners, and references to passive integration pathways that, when paired with the map, made it clear his land had always been viewed as a transitional zone. One comment, scrawled in the margins of a meeting summary, struck him hardest. Randy, plot likely vulnerable. Low political friction, no active civic engagement. Vulnerable. They had profiled his silence, his independence, his refusal to show up at town halls or public sessions, and used it to assume weakness. They believed he wouldn't respond, that he would grumble, maybe file a letter or two, but ultimately cave under the pressure of procedure. They'd gambled that he was alone. But Mark wasn't alone anymore. Quietly, and without broadcasting it, he had reached out to several other landowners in the area. Ranchers, orchard managers, even a retired veterinarian who still owned a stretch of undeveloped hillside. He didn't give them speeches or rally cries. He simply showed them the same map he'd received, pointed to the trail markings, and asked one question. Did anyone ask your permission? In every case, the answer was no. And with each conversation, he watched a familiar transformation take hold, confusion becoming clarity, then frustration, then resolve. They weren't activists. They didn't care about protests or movements. But they knew land, and they knew what it meant to lose it without being asked. Together, the 5 of them drafted a joint letter to the Planning Commission, co-signed and notarized, requesting that any public trail discussions involving private property be postponed pending individual landowner consultation. Mark ensured it was filed as a public record, attached with copies of each property deed and boundary map. It wasn't aggressive, it was procedural, calm, and precise. But the message beneath the legalese was unmistakable. They knew. They were watching now. And the silence that had once been mistaken for consent was over. The day before the public meeting, Mark received another envelope. This one hand-delivered, no name, no signature. Inside was a folded copy of a deed survey. Not his, not any of his neighbors, but it was marked up in red ink with speculative notations, adjusted trail routes, construction estimates, cost projections. It was internal, clearly never meant to be seen outside a boardroom. And that meant someone on the inside, whether out of guilt, principle, or personal stake, wanted him to see just how far the planning had gone. This was no longer about a footbridge. It was infrastructure strategy dressed up as community enhancement. And Mark's land, along with several others, was the spine of it. He didn't sleep much that night. The silence of the house, once comforting, now felt weighted. He walked the property line twice, flashlight in hand, boots crunching through dried grass and mud. His fences stood intact, his gates locked, but the sense of intrusion was no longer physical. It was procedural, institutional. His boundaries weren't being crossed by feet or vehicles, but by filings, votes, and agendas carried out behind closed doors with terms like long-term connectivity and regional integration. What made it worse was the calmness of it, the way every move was buried beneath layers of paperwork, how plausible deniability had become the shield for what was essentially engineered land acquisition. At the public meeting, Mark didn't speak first. He waited, watching as development reps gave their presentations, bright slides filled with renderings of greenways, biking trails, scenic overlooks. The room nodded along, polite and detached. Then the commission opened the floor for a public comment, and Mark stood, stepping forward without fanfare. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rant. He simply laid down a packet of documents. His deed, the unfiled easement request, the surveillance camera photos, the anonymous internal map. And then he spoke, not as a protester or antagonist, but as a man who had been patient for far too long. "This isn't about a trail," he said. "It's about procedure, about respect, about recognizing that private land isn't a gray zone to be rewritten by momentum. What you're calling access is intrusion. What you're calling progress is preemption. And if you think any of this will continue without consequence, you've misread the people you're dealing with." Silence followed, not because of outrage or embarrassment, but because it was undeniable. Too many of the details were real, too many documents clear, and too many other landowners present in the room, standing quietly behind him, arms folded. No protest signs, no slogans, just presence. It was enough. The commission tabled the vote. Officially, they claimed the matter needed further community review. But Mark knew what it meant. They'd been checked, not defeated, not undone, but checked. And for the first time in weeks, Mark walked back to his truck with something like relief. Not because it was over, but because they finally knew he was not going to be the man they expected. A week after the Planning Commission indefinitely postponed the trail vote, the tension around Mark's property didn't dissipate. It thickened. There were no more community flyers or vague editorials, no more friendly language about connectivity or shared access. That veneer had cracked. What replaced it was sharper, more deliberate. The first sign was subtle. His water delivery was delayed 3 days without explanation. Then, the fencing supplies he'd ordered from the local mill were redirected to another customer in error. At first glance, it looked like simple mismanagement or local logistics gone awry. But Mark had lived in this part of the county long enough to know how the machine worked when it wanted to make life difficult without leaving fingerprints. You wouldn't get threatened. Your land would just stop cooperating. Contractors would suddenly become unavailable. Supplies would go missing. You'd spend your time fixing things that never broke before. It was a play straight from the old handbook of slow attrition. And Mark had no intention of letting it grind him down. He began documenting everything, not just the major developments, but the inconveniences, the rerouted deliveries, the sudden appearance of marked utility flags near his north gate, the suspicious emails from zoning staffers requesting confirmation of his parcel ID for environmental compliance purposes. He didn't respond directly to any of them. Instead, he had Westbrook file a protective order with the county office, requesting that all contact with regard to his land be directed exclusively through legal counsel. It was a procedural wall, not an aggressive one, but one that made it clear any further action against him would be scrutinized through the lens of legal propriety. And yet, the escalation didn't stop. One morning, Mark discovered that the livestock gate along his western border had been left open. 3 of his cattle had wandered out, fortunately not far, but far enough to pose a danger had they strayed closer to the road. The latch hadn't broken, it had been unfastened. He installed a new lock that same day and added motion-triggered lighting to the entire stretch of fence, along with a discreet surveillance unit pointed directly at the gate. Not the cheap cloud-connected type, but a hardwired system with encrypted storage, buried power, and no remote access. He'd learned by now that visibility wasn't the same as security. You had to plan for removal, interference, and plausible deniability. 3 nights later, the lights tripped at 2:17 a.m. Mark, already sleeping with one ear tuned to the frequency of unease, jolted awake and moved to the monitors in his study. The footage showed 2 figures, one walking the edge of the property line, the other crouched near the fencing. They weren't kids. Their gait was too purposeful. They wore dark clothing, faces obscured by hoods or masks, but they moved like people who had done this before. They didn't cross the fence. They just lingered, observed, and then disappeared into the tree line the way they'd come. Mark didn't call the sheriff. He'd already done that once, and the response had been perfunctory. He made a copy of the footage, stored it in 2 encrypted drives, and sent one to Westbrook, the other to a private security consultant he'd recently contacted, an ex-Forest Service investigator who specialized in rural property disputes. The man, Kurt Madden, didn't ask useless questions when Mark explained the situation. He just said he'd be out within 48 hours, and that he'd bring his own gear. That's what Mark wanted. No hand-holding, no dramatics, just someone who understood how these things worked on the ground. When Madden arrived, he didn't look like much. Old jeans, field jacket, short-cropped hair, and a flatline expression that didn't shift even after Mark walked him through everything. He took his time, inspected the fencing, reviewed the surveillance footage, examined the topography near the creek and the footprint of the old bridge site. Then he nodded once and said, "They're not trying to scare you. They're testing response time, seeing how fast you notice, how far you'll go. It's pressure, nothing more." Mark asked what came next. Madden shrugged. "They're getting bolder. That's how these things go when bureaucratic force doesn't work. They'll either try to buy someone close to your property, or they'll look for a reason to escalate legally. Sabotage, maybe, or a violation they can pin on you. That's the next phase." It didn't take long for the prediction to come true. The following Monday, Mark received a formal citation from the county's Environmental Oversight Board, accusing him of unauthorized land alteration near a riparian zone, code for working near the creek. The citation claimed he had conducted unauthorized grading and trenching, despite the fact that the only work he'd done in the past year had been standard maintenance approved and documented well in advance. But the citation was strategic. It wasn't about winning in court. It was about opening an enforcement file, something that could be referenced by future complaints and used to argue for a broader investigation. In other words, it was the groundwork for building a narrative that Mark was unstable, careless, or worse, willfully violating land management standards. He called Westbrook again, who sighed with professional frustration and filed an immediate appeal. But even he admitted the maneuver was textbook. "They're laying kindling," he said. "They don't have a fire yet, but they're hoping you'll light it yourself." But Mark didn't lash out. He didn't confront the committee. He didn't storm into the planning office or plaster his fences with warnings. Instead, he responded in kind, with quiet, unshakable resolve. He expanded his network, contacting the owners of the adjacent parcels that bordered the proposed trail corridor. Some were absentee landlords, others retirees who had no idea their land was being earmarked for access optimization. Mark offered to handle the legal filings for them. No cost, no involvement required, just a signature to confirm their objection. 4 agreed. That was enough to disrupt the continuity of the proposed path. Without a continuous stretch of access, the trail extension would be invalidated under State Infrastructure Code. At the same time, Madden installed a remote sensor grid across Mark's eastern boundary. It wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense. No cameras, no audio. Just thermal motion tracking with silent alerts that could detect large movement patterns over time. It was a system designed not to catch people, but to track frequency. Within a week, they had mapped the pattern. Every third night between 2 and 4 a.m., someone crossed the creek, lingered for exactly 7 minutes, and then left. Always the same window, always the same duration. They weren't scouting, they were marking time. Then, on a cold Wednesday morning, Mark woke to find something new. Spray painted on the inside of his barn's metal door, just beneath the latch, were the words, "Sell before it rots." The handwriting was tight, practiced, and the paint still tacky. He didn't call the sheriff this time. He called Westbrook and Madden and told them it was time to bring everything forward. By noon, Mark's attorney had filed a full complaint with the county board, naming the development committee and its affiliated construction partners as parties of interest in an escalating campaign of coordinated harassment. They didn't have proof of every action, but they didn't need it. They had timing, motive, documentation, and enough legal ambiguity to force a formal review. And with that, the game changed. Because the one thing developers feared more than a stubborn landowner was oversight. They had pushed too far, too fast. And now Mark wasn't the one under the microscope. They were. The formal complaint filed by Westbrook had been intended as a defensive maneuver, a way to draw a line in the sand and force the board to acknowledge the pressure campaign against Mark. What no one expected, least of all Mark himself, was that the complaint would be picked up for fast-track internal review by the county's own legal department. Within a week, an investigator from the Office of Property Rights Compliance contacted Westbrook directly, asking for supporting documentation, interview availability, and any material evidence related to potential coercion or unlawful land targeting. Westbrook, to his credit, was prepared. Every email, every citation, every piece of footage and communication was already cataloged and indexed, including the surveillance reports Madden had compiled, the thermal tracking logs, the spray-painted threat, the rerouted deliveries, all of it. The evidence wasn't explosive, but taken together, it revealed a systematic effort to erode the rights and endurance of one landowner through indirect intimidation. Mark didn't allow himself to celebrate. The game wasn't over. If anything, the next stage would be the most volatile because now the other side was cornered, not yet exposed, but facing exposure. And people who operate in shadows tend to react badly to spotlights. It started with silence. For 5 days, nothing happened. No utility flags, no strange vehicles, no new emails or veiled administrative gestures. The pressure valve had been shut, and it felt like the land was holding its breath. Then, just before dawn on the 6th day, a fire broke out in the grove near the southern edge of Mark's property, far enough from the house and structures to avoid catastrophic damage, but close enough to scorch 100 yards of grassland and threaten the boundary fence. The fire moved fast but didn't spread wide, and local responders contained it within 45 minutes. The fire chief cited dry ground, probably an ember from a careless fire pit, but Mark knew better. He had walked that stretch the day before. There were no campsites, no signs of visitors, no wind-blown hazards, but now, in the ash, he found melted fragments of what looked like a butane lighter shell, lodged in a blackened root bed where the flames had started. He handed the remains over to Madden, who bagged them and made a separate report. This wasn't just escalation. This was desperation, and that made it more dangerous than anything that had come before. Whoever was behind the harassment wasn't just probing now, they were sending a warning. Mark felt the weight of it as he stood at the edge of the scorched earth, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, the sun rising through the haze like a muted threat. This was no longer about paths or easements. This was about breaking his will. But Mark didn't bend. He hardened. He filed a secondary report with the county's fire investigation unit, citing the recent pattern of surveillance and vandalism. Westbrook submitted a copy to the Office of Property Rights Compliance. The response was immediate. An on-site inspection scheduled within 48 hours by the Oversight Department, including a forensic property assessor, a legal liaison, and a public safety officer. For the first time, the system that had been weaponized against Mark was now turning its focus inward, scrutinizing the actions of the very people who had tried to make him disappear beneath paperwork and procedural sleight of hand. When the officials arrived, Mark greeted them without ceremony, leading them first to the site of the fire, then to the location of the former bridge, now marked by faded tire ruts and construction debris still half buried beneath wild grass. He showed them the footage, the maps, the easement requests filed after the fact, the anonymous planning notes he'd received with red markings and budget projections. Madden accompanied the group at Mark's request, explaining the motion patterns, the regular trespass routes, and the heat signatures captured on the eastern border. The oversight team listened without commentary, took extensive notes, asked precise questions, and left without offering conclusions. Mark didn't expect praise or reassurance. He didn't need it. The wheels had turned, and now the question wasn't whether they'd act. It was how fast and how far they were willing to go. He didn't have to wait long for an answer. 5 days later, a subpoena was issued by the county board to the development's legal counsel, requesting full records of all land use planning sessions, communication logs with private contractors, and internal project funding documentation for the last calendar year. Word reached Westbrook that the board had voted to open a formal inquiry into unethical pressure practices in connection to trail development proposals, with Mark's case designated as the primary example. That wasn't a victory yet, but it was no longer a solitary fight. It was public now, institutional. And that's when the final gambit came. On the night of the full moon, under a sky half-clouded and dead quiet, Mark's eastern field was invaded. It wasn't a protest or demonstration. It was construction. 3 trucks pulled in through the adjacent development road, headlights off, rolling quietly across the ridge and parking just beyond the line of fence where the old bridge had once stood. 6 men stepped out. No uniforms, no visible logos, just gloves, headlamps, and a generator. Within minutes, they began unloading materials: wood panels, cement bags, post hole diggers. They were going to rebuild the bridge. No permission, no delay, no more waiting on bureaucracy. Madden, who had installed a secondary motion tripwire just days earlier, woke Mark the moment the first vehicle crossed the sensor. By the time Mark reached the overlook with binoculars, the men had already begun digging. He didn't speak. He didn't approach. Instead, he dialed the private security dispatch attached to Madden's consultancy and reported an illegal construction action in progress. Then he called the oversight team's liaison, whose number he now had directly. It took 17 minutes for the first patrol car to arrive, another 8 for a compliance officer. By the time they crested the hill, the lights caught the crew mid-action. One man up to his elbows in concrete mix, another bolting crossbeams, others freezing as the floodlights lit their faces. The officers separated them, took IDs, and started questioning. Mark remained at a distance, watching, silent. One of the men refused to identify who had hired him. Another claimed they were volunteers, but couldn't explain why they had blueprints and a generator. The lead officer took statements and eventually impounded the vehicles pending investigation. Later that night, Westbrook called. He'd been contacted by a friend in the county prosecutor's office. Charges were being considered: trespass, unlawful land modification, and conspiracy to circumvent a pending land use inquiry. It was too early to tell what would stick, but the damage was done. Not to Mark, but to them. Their denial had been shattered by their own impatience. They had played a long game, but in the end, they overplayed their hand. Mark stood alone again in the dawn that followed, boots rooted in the cooling earth as the wind rustled across a field no longer in question. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat, but he knew what the silence meant now. It wasn't the calm before the storm. It was the storm having passed. In the weeks following the midnight confrontation, the noise around Mark's land shifted from the subtle manipulations of planning committees and covert maneuvering to the rustle of formal statements, legal memos, and quiet resignations behind closed doors. No one came forward publicly to claim responsibility for the illegal bridge reconstruction attempt, but the contractor's presence on his land was irrefutable. Their equipment, their prints, their silence, it all worked against them in the court of oversight. County investigators took their time, threading the details together piece by piece. The public narrative, once cloaked in vague terminology about connectivity and communal benefit, now had a different tone. Breach of process, abuse of influence, and attempted imposition of unapproved infrastructure. The local paper ran a small column buried deep in the community section, noting the suspension of 2 infrastructure consultants for contractual irregularities. The piece named no names, cited no sources, but Mark understood its purpose. This was their way of drawing the curtain without admitting the play had ever been staged. On his land, peace returned not as a celebration, but as an absence. The missing grind of tires over gravel that didn't belong, the disappearance of unfamiliar shapes on the horizon, the fading smell of treated lumber and chemical adhesive. The stolen quiet crept back in slowly, like a cautious guest unsure if it was still welcome. But Mark welcomed it. He didn't rebuild fences out of spite or plant flags of victory. Instead, he reinforced what mattered. The eastern edge of his property, once passive and unguarded, became active again. Not fortified, he refused to live like a prisoner, but deliberate. A new gate installed. Boundary markers refreshed. A single weathered sign hung on the edge of the path that once led to the bridge, engraved not with threats or warnings but a simple phrase. Private land. No access. No negotiation. The county's inquiry remained open for 3 months, long enough for the Development Board's legal team to withdraw its proposed trail project indefinitely. There was no formal apology, no public exoneration. That wasn't how these things ended. Not out here. Vindication arrived not as a verdict, but as silence. The kind of silence that meant they'd stopped looking this way. Mark never received another letter. No more citations. No more polite inquiries about future utility easements or integration paths. The map they had tried to redraw had reverted, and this time his name sat where it always had. Fixed, unyielding, unbroken. The neighbors he'd once spoken to only at feed stores or across fence lines began dropping by one. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet gratitude. A few offered to coordinate property lines for mutual reinforcement. Nothing binding, just understanding. And that mattered more than signatures. For the first time, Mark felt a different kind of ownership. Not just of land, but of place. He had held his ground not with force but with evidence, process, and patience. And others had seen it. Not everyone would fight, he knew. Some didn't have the energy, the resources, or the appetite for it. But now they knew it could be done. That mattered. He continued his work without change. Fences mended, irrigation lines tended, livestock rotated. But there was a new rhythm to the land, like it breathed a little easier. He slept deeper. The cameras remained, but not as warnings, just tools, like any others on a ranch. The logs they kept rarely lit up anymore. A few deer, the occasional coyote. Nothing in boots. That, alone, was its own kind of justice. Westbrook checked in less frequently now. The final filings had been archived, no open cases, no pending threats. One day, the attorney sent Mark a short email with nothing but a single sentence. "You held the line. That matters more than most will ever know." Mark didn't reply. He printed the message, folded it carefully, and slid it into the back of his property folder, between the deed and the satellite images from the first week of the conflict. A record, not of what had been done to him, but of what he had done in return. Autumn came early that year. The pastures browned faster, and the creek ran leaner, but it brought clarity in the air. Mark would sometimes sit on the ridge where the bridge once stood, the grass tall again, the soil healing. He'd sip coffee from a dented thermos, boots crossed, watching the wind press through the dry stalks. He didn't think about the bridge anymore, not with anger. not even with satisfaction, just as a reminder of how close a line can come to being erased and how far you sometimes have to go to make sure it stays right where it belongs. There were no endings in places like this, only seasons. But some seasons marked more than weather. Some marked resistance, integrity, ownership in the truest sense. And as the frost returned and the mornings thickened with silence again, Mark Randy remained where he always had, a man not of triumph, but of proof, that even when the system bends, even when the push comes without warning, some land doesn't move. Not an inch,